Okay, let's say we actually want to start implementing our timer functionality inside of our timer extension. Well, the easiest way to do that would be to use the JavaScript setInterval method, where you can pass in a function and have it run every second or so. But the problem is if that JavaScript is running inside of the pop-up, then the timer only runs while the pop-up is open. And a good timer would definitely run in the background while the user is browsing other parts of the web and not opening the pop-up. So if we actually head over to our manifest file, there's actually a field called the background field. And what the background field is it represents a background script, which is implemented using a JavaScript service worker. As the name implies, a background script is pretty much a JavaScript file that always runs in the background while your Chrome extension is installed. That way you can do work while the pop-up isn't open. For a bit of a basic introduction to service workers, there's actually a lot of documentation about it inside of the Web Fundamentals documentation on developers.google.com, but we won't go through all of it. We're only going to go through this little flowchart about what a service worker is, because a background script is essentially just a JavaScript service worker. And what happens is when you install the extension, it either installs this background script service worker or it'll error out right away. But if it doesn't error out right away, it goes into this activated state. And then once it's in the activated state, it will be idle until either it receives some kind of message to do some kind of work. For example, if you have some kind of event listener on the background script and some user event triggers that listener, then the service worker will wake up and do some work, and then it'll go back into this idle state. And there's also the terminated state, which seems to imply that the service worker would not be working, but in the terminated state, it can actually wake up again and go back to the idle state and do more work. But don't worry too much about what specific states this background script / service worker is in. All we really need to know is that the service worker is a JavaScript that is running in the background while your Chrome extension is installed, and it's always running, but at times it can go to sleep. And this will cause some issues for us, as we'll see once we get into a couple of examples. So let's head over to our manifest file and actually implement this background script. We'll go ahead and add in the background field. And we can see that it's an object with a service worker field. And inside of the service worker field, all you have to do is pass in a JavaScript file. So in our case, we'll call it background.js. Okay, looking good. We'll create a new file, background.js. And then just for demonstration purposes, all we'll do for now is do console.log hello from the background script. So if we head over to our extensions tab and refresh our extension, you can see that suddenly we have this inspect views service worker option. And when we hit inspect, we can see that it says hello from the background script. And we'll notice that this is the same Chrome DevTools, except in comparison to our pop-up, we don't have this Elements tab because the background script is all JavaScript. So it only has the JavaScript console and some of the other JavaScript-related DevTools available. And another thing that's interesting to note is that if we actually do a console.log this, instead of our background script, and we'll actually head over to our pop-up, and for demo purposes, we'll do a console.log this, and then we'll refresh our extension. We can see that when we inspect the background script, that this is something called the service worker global scope, meaning that this JavaScript is a service worker. And in comparison, if we look at the console for our pop-up, we can see that when we console.log this, it's inside of the window scope. And we can see that as a result, the pop-up has a bunch of different elements and functions that aren't on the service worker and vice versa. And you can read more about these specific scopes in the MDN documentation. We won't worry too much about the differences between the two scopes, but just be aware that the service worker does not have the exact same functionality as the JavaScript you would usually have inside of a regular HTML document. For the most part, you can still treat the background script as just a regular old JavaScript file. There are only a couple of small nuances that we really need to worry about, but when those appear, we'll talk about them. So let's clean this up by removing our console logs, and then we'll head over to our background. And what we'll do is, let's actually implement our timer. We'll have let time equals to 0, so that we can track the time, and we'll do a simple set interval call that has a function. And all the function will do is increment the time by 1, and then it'll console.log the time. And we'll have this happen every 1000 milliseconds, which is every second. So if we refresh our extension and inspect our views, we can see that our set interval call is happening, and this timer is running every 1 second, even without our pop-up being open. But if we close the DevTools, and then wait for just a couple of seconds, we'll notice now that the service worker is now in the inactive state, which means that it is currently sleeping and not doing any work. And then when you open it up again, it actually wakes it up. And you'll see that the timer starts again from 1. Because what happens is that when the service worker goes inactive, the JavaScript inside of background.js stops running. And then when it wakes up again, it'll reassign the let variable time to equal to 0, and then restart the timer from the beginning, essentially. Service workers always idle after a while, since they're event-driven, because they only do work when they're given work to do. And these set interval calls don't count as events, in a sense.